because President Trump is on his way back now to Washington this morning after wrapping up his highly anticipated meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One, the president says the two sides agreed on, quote, almost everything, and that a trade deal could be signed, quote, pretty soon, adding that there weren't many stumbling blocks left. Trump, who rated the meeting a 12 out of 10, offered few specifics, but emphasized that the two leaders made progress on several key issues. He says China will pause restrictions on rare earth exports and buy large amounts of American soybeans, while the U.S. will reduce fentanyl-related tariffs placed on Chinese goods. That's going to bring the overall levy on Chinese goods to 47%, coming down from 57%. The president also said that Taiwan never came up, in his words, amid speculation that the Chinese leader might try to push Trump to publicly oppose the island's independence. Moments after today's talks concluded, President Trump already previewed the next meeting between these two leaders, saying he plans to visit Beijing in April and that Xi will travel to the U.S. sometime after that. President Trump's meeting with the Chinese leader was the last stop on his trade-focused tour across Asia this week. Yesterday, the president met with his South Korean counterpart, where the two agreed to a long-awaited trade deal between these two countries. South Korea will invest $350 billion into the United States in exchange for lower tariffs, which will now be set at 15%. The president says South Korea also committed to purchasing U.S. oil and gas in vast quantities, and he gave the country his approval to build a nuclear-powered submarine in Philadelphia, citing a stronger-than-ever military alliance between these two nations. I want to bring in the reporter who's been covering it all across multiple countries in Asia for us, live from Busan, South Korea, MSNBC senior White House reporter Vaughn Hilliard. Vaughn, you've been on the ground. You've been watching all of these meetings, but of course it all culminated in that face-to-face with President Xi. Talk about what stood out to you there, because I was reading some of your editorial notes, and yes, on its face, it sounds like a lot of progress was made, but when it comes to specifics, we're still a bit light on those, right?
Right, exactly, Ali. That's where we're at in this game. And if you actually, the Chinese just released a statement a few moments before us coming on air, and they didn't get into the details of any of it. And they made no mention of a trade deal as having been in the works. They made no mention of TikTok authorization or of Taiwan or of buying U.S. agricultural goods. It was a much broader tone that the Chinese were messaging out of this and saying that the two sides should ratchet down the retaliatory nature of their relationship and understand that a bilateral economic relationship would be beneficial to both of the world's top two economic superpowers. Of course, there's a lot that goes into that statement by the Chinese. Yeah. We understand that they have used a lot of tactics to, take advantage of other regional players and have understandably tried to take the U.S. in a different direction. This is a moment here for President Trump, however, who called for this meeting to take place. This was the first time they had met in face-to-face in 6 years. And President Trump walked away by suggesting that a trade deal could happen, quote, pretty soon. Of course, it took the first Trump administration 18 months to just get to a phase one part of a deal, which included guarantees of buying agricultural goods. The Chinese never upheld their end of the bargain on that. And while President Trump said that he got that guarantee here in Busan from the Chinese leader, exactly how many soybeans and exactly how much other agricultural goods did they commit to buying? We don't know at this point in time. We do know that they stopped buying soybeans altogether in response to the escalatory nature of his tariffs and trade war earlier this year. So there's still a lot of open-ended question marks about exactly what they hammered out and to what extent that's actually on paper.
Yeah, I think that's important when we're tracking the trade piece of it. But you bring up two things that weren't discussed, and I think that they're pretty glaring. First, the TikTok deal, because the expectation had been that after much fanfare about the U.S. plan to take over TikTok and help it stay active in the U.S., that had to be brought to the Chinese leader. Ultimately, it wasn't discussed. And then the other thing I think was interesting is that Trump said that they didn't really discuss China's purchases of Russian oil. That's another interesting piece that seems to have been left out of these talking discussion points. What do you make of both of those?
And they also didn't talk about Taiwan. These are major issues that had been suggested that they would be a part of the subject matter. And that is where President Trump, coming into this meeting, had said that the ByteDance, the China-backed a company that owns TikTok, which has been negotiating with the Trump administration, that it would come down to the final authorization of President Xi for the terms of this deal to move forward. So I don't have an understanding of exactly what this process looks like from here. It is hard to imagine that this deal would fall apart, but understanding that President Trump was the one that openly acknowledged it required President Xi's approval, that's a question mark. And then in terms of the other component there, in terms of the sort of the axis of upheaval, if you will, this relationship between President Putin and President Xi, the American president said that the two men did in fact talk about Russia's war against Ukraine and that both of them agreed that it should come to an end, but didn't get into the details of exactly how they would get the two countries to bring an end to the war. And especially understanding that China relies, as President Trump acknowledged, on a heavy amount of Russian oil and gas, but did not suggest that there would be any increased pressure on China to stop purchasing that oil and gas. And this all comes at a time in which earlier this year, Ali, right, the U.S. president had placed 145% tariffs on China, which had effectively amounted to an embargo, and then brought that tariff rate down to 55%. He announced that he's bringing it down to 47% because he's convinced that China's addressing some fentanyl issues in terms of fentanyl shipments that make their way to the U.S. But 47% is still an exceedingly high tariff rate. And again, as you said here, for the open-ended question marks and the lack of guarantees on things like forcing Russia's hand by stopping buying Russian oil, he didn't get those sort of commitments, it appears, at this hour.
Yeah, and I think that was something that several folks on the Hill that I've been talking to were looking towards as they seek to put pressure on Russia to end its war in Ukraine. You've got a lot of questions left to ask your sources. I think there's one more here that I want to talk to you about, because shortly before his meeting with President Xi Jinping, President Trump announced the U.S. will resume testing nuclear weapons. In a social media post, Trump wrote that he's ordered the Pentagon to resume testing on an equal basis with Russia and China. The U.S. conducted its last nuclear weapons test in 1992. Former President George H.W. Bush signed a moratorium on testing that year. Here's then what President Trump said on Air Force One overnight when asked about his social media post. Watch.
We have more nuclear weapons than anybody. We don't do testing, and we've halted it many years ago. But with others doing testing, I think it's appropriate that we do also.
Any details around the testing, sir? Like where, when?
It'll be announced. You know, we have test sites. It'll be announced.
This is going to raise some eyebrows, certainly. Is this a leverage play? What do you think is behind this move? And put it into perspective for us a bit.
Right. He said that it was not in direct response to any actions by China, but instead we know in the last 36 hours that Vladimir Putin had announced that they had tested a nuclear-powered underwater drone that could create a tsunami-like condition in a coastal city, and that came just after they launched another nuclear-powered missile via air. And this is, for the U.S. president, was a clear indication that the U.S. is aware of these nuclear-powered capability efforts, and understanding that this is the same man that suggested that he had intentions of meeting with Kim Jong-un. That obviously didn't come to fruition here, but Kim Jong-un and the North Koreans have resisted over the last 7 years, denuclearizing themselves. And so President Trump called for at least a de-escalation in nuclear capabilities. And that is where he saw coming into this meeting potentially an opening to try to have President Xi, who is close with Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, to begin opening up those conversations. As you just heard from the president, though, there's also that open question of just how detailed and just how expansive of a conversation was that about nuclear capabilities with President Xi. It's not clear here.
Yeah, not clear. A lot of questions following the president back here to the U.S. A 12 out of 10 report from MSNBC senior White House reporter Vaughn Hilliard, live with us from South Korea. Thank you for your work this morning and, of course, all of your work overseas. Travel back safely.